Hello, I'm Jonathan Engelsma. In our fourth lecture, we're going to start looking at the iOS SDK, and we're going to look at some very essential concepts. In particular, we're going to review the ModelViewController Architecture that iOS apps use, and we're going to develop a better understanding of view controllers, one of the elements of this triad, and the life cycle that iOS uses when it manages these. And we're going to look at a number of commonly used iOS view controllers. So first of all, ModelViewController. In ModelView architectures, our code is broken up into three different components: model, view, and controller. The model is the data that our application produces and consumes. So it's just a representation of any data that our application is going to use. The view, on the other hand, is what the user sees displayed on the screen, and also it's what they interact with. So the view are things such as buttons and scroll views and table views and so forth. The controller then is the entity that manages both the model and the view. You can think of the controller as the glue that kind of ties model and view together. In particular, the controller can interact directly with the model. So the controller has knowledge of the model. In fact, one of the responsibilities of the controller is to either make sure the model comes into existence or to receive it from perhaps another view controller. The controller can also manipulate the view directly. So it has knowledge of what's in the view, what UI controls are out there, and what it can do with those controls. And what happens in iOS is when we need to have access to something in the view, we're going to do this via what we call an outlet. So an outlet is basically a variable on a controller or a property on a controller that references a control out in the view hierarchy. So if I had a label and I wanted to be able to change the text on the label out there on my view, I would create an outlet in my controller and wire it up so that it references that particular label. Now, it's very important that the model and the view never talk directly to each other. So we've drawn that as a solid line here. This is not good. We don't want to create unnecessary dependencies. So the view is independent of the model and vice versa, and any interaction between them happens via the controller. Now, views can sort of talk to the controller, but only in a very controlled manner. Views don't really have detailed knowledge of what controller is managing them. Instead, controllers define actions. And actions are simply chunks of code that the controller will execute in response to an event that is generated by the view. So if there's a button, for example, displayed in the view, and the user presses that button, we can basically wire up actions in the controller that get executed whenever that button is activated. Now, the other way that the view will communicate or interact with the controller is via delegation. So delegation is a very common pattern used all over in the iOS frameworks. And the idea here is that a class, instead of implementing something, is going to delegate it to another class. And there's two types of protocols that are commonly implemented by the controller. One of them is data source. So if a view has to populate data, for example, if there's a table view that shows a list of items, then there will be a data source protocol defined by the table view that the table view controller will typically implement. And there's also just generic delegate protocols that various views implement that are implemented by the controller. So for example, maybe I dismiss a alert, and I might have a delegate implemented on my controller that responds to that type of thing. There's also, for table view controller, there's a delegate which the controller implements to help define some of the visual characteristics of that table. So continue on to our next video, and we'll actually do a really simple code example where we demonstrate the ModelViewController concept in a very straightforward way.